AI is a powerful tool.
This summit can help ensure that artificial intelligence charts a course that benefits humanity and bolsters our shared values.
Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Harrison Zhang, and I'm a current researcher at Harvard Medical School and an aspiring MD PhD student. Today it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Chiang, who is going to be our distinguished speaker today. And he's going to be talking to us about how the vision field has inspired a lot of applications of AI in medicine. So Dr. Michael Chiang is the current director of the National Eye Institute at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. By background, he is a pediatric ophthalmologist and is also board certified in clinical informatics. His research focuses on the interface of biomedical informatics and clinical ophthalmology in areas such as retinopathy of prematurity, telehealth, artificial intelligence, electronic health records, data science, and genotype-phenotype correlation. Dr. Chiang is an adjunct investigator at the National Library of Medicine, and his group has published over 250 peer-reviewed papers and developed an assistive artificial intelligence system for ROP that received breakthrough status from the US FDA. Now, Dr. Chiang began at the NIH in November of 2020, but before coming to the NIH, he received his bachelor's in electrical engineering and biology from Stanford, an MD from Harvard Medical School and the Harvard-MIT Division of Health Sciences and Technology, and an MA in biomedical informatics from Columbia. He further completed residency and pediatric ophthalmology fellowship training at the Johns Hopkins University, Wilmer Eye Institute, and Dr. Chiang has been a faculty member at Columbia and Oregon Health and Science University. He further co-directed an NIH-funded T32 training program in visual science for graduate students and research fellows, as well as an NIH-funded K-12 clinician scientist program at OHSU. Now, before we begin, just like to again thank everyone for joining us today. And I'd like to remind everyone that should you have any questions that come up during the talk, please do add it to the neural network chat, and we'll be sure to ask Dr. Chiang the question once his presentation concludes. So without further ado, it gives me tremendous pleasure to invite Dr. Michael Chiang to talk. Thank you.
Harrison, thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak in this venue. And what I'll do is share my slides, and we'll go ahead and get started. As I thought through what to speak about, I talked with Harrison, and he's, what I decided to do is speak a little bit about my own academic background, which was research in artificial intelligence and data science as regards to ophthalmology, and also try to tie that into what we're doing now at the National Eye Institute. In other words, how my academic background has informed what we're doing, and how this really has given insight into AI for health overall. And so I'll give examples in ophthalmology and vision for AI, try to relate to how that pertains to healthcare overall and artificial intelligence, and the programs that we're building at the National Eye Institute. Okay. And so what is the National Eye Institute? We were founded in 1968 by Congress and then President Lyndon Johnson as the branch of the National Institutes of Health to manage national efforts in vision science in the US. Okay, what we do is we direct and we fund vision research. Our budget this year is about $896 million. And obviously the reason that we exist is because of the impact of vision on quality of life. But one of the points that I want to make is that vision research has a broad impact on science overall. At the National Eye Institute, we're really proud to have supported the work of 8 Nobel Prize winners. And the point that I want to make with this is that there are a lot of seminal innovations that occurred first in the eye and the visual system, because it's a really accessible system for doing research that then gets generalized to other areas. And obviously AI is going to be one example that I'm going to try to draw from here today. So with that, some motivation, from an ophthalmology and health perspective. One of the reasons that we need these technologies is that clinical diagnosis is not always straightforward. The National Academy of Medicine in the US created a report on diagnostic errors in 2015, basically showing that, regardless of whether you're dealing with outpatient healthcare, patient deaths, adverse events in hospitals, or medical malpractice, medical legal issues, clinical diagnosis is a really significant problem. And one of the points that I want to make is that ophthalmology diagnosis is often very descriptive and subjective and qualitative, and it may even be worse of a problem in ophthalmology. So one disease that I became interested in early in my career is called retinopathy of prematurity. Okay, this is a disease that premature babies get, and it was basically started in the 1940s, 1950s, because before then, premature babies didn't survive long enough to really develop this disease. And one of the people in the US who became really well known with ROP, retinopathy of prematurity, was Stevie Wonder, the singer, who was born in the 1950s before there was a treatment for this disease. Now, the way you diagnose ROP is that you look at the retina, which is in the back of the eye with lenses. And based on the structure of the retina, you can diagnose retinopathy of prematurity. And initially in the 1940s, through the 1980s, the diagnosis was purely descriptive. Okay, you use lenses, looked in the back of the retina, and you use words and drawings to describe what you saw. Okay, this is very classic ophthalmic diagnosis. And that changed in the 1980s when the International Classification of ROP was developed. And what this created was an international standard for clinical eye exams, where you looked at all those descriptive and qualitative things in the retina. And the terminology, the ICROP terminology, created standard parameters. And those parameters happen to be called zone, stage, clock hour, stent, and plus disease. And when everybody uses those same terminology, those same parameters, that improves clinical care, and it creates an infrastructure for multi-center clinical trials. And I would point out that most fields in ophthalmology and medicine, even in 2023, do not have this standardized terminology. And so when everybody uses the same terminology, we can do those clinical trials. And what those clinical trials showed is that of those parameters, plus disease is by far the most critical parameter for determining when a baby's at risk for going blind and when you need to treat that baby. So you treat these babies with laser or with injections of medicines into the eye. And so we've got to get the diagnosis of plus disease accurate. Okay, plus disease is either a yes, no, thing. And what it means is tortuosity and dilation of the vessels in the back of the retina. Okay, so we've got to get that diagnosis correct. Okay, plus disease. Now, the problem is that we're not very good at getting plus disease correct. Tens of millions of dollars of research went into determining that plus disease is by far the most critical parameter for identifying blindness and treatment. And so we got to get this diagnosis correct. In 2007, though, we published we did an embarrassingly basic study where we uploaded images to a website and asked world experts to log in and diagnose, is it plus, is it not plus? And there's actually an intermediate category called pre-plus. Okay, and here's an example. This one, you see some tortuosity of the vessels, and there's a little bit of thickness, dilation. Half of experts called this plus, half called it not plus. We had a lot of images split 50-50 or 60-40. And intuitively, this is a big problem when the world experts split 50-50 on something that's the most critical part of diagnosis. And so when you get different experts, okay, this is 8 different world experts, look at 100 different images here, there's a lot of interesting things that happen. Okay, so Pete Campbell and Jayashri Kalpathy-Kramer, wrote some really nice papers on this. So the way to read this graph is that if that expert number 1 here diagnosed that image, okay, each of these columns is an image as plus, the box is red. If they diagnose it pre-plus, the box is yellow. And if they diagnose it as normal, the box is in green. Okay, so the first thing to notice here is that experts 7 and 8 at the bottom diagnose plus disease 6 times more often than expert number 1. Okay, and if you go to a different set of images down at the bottom, it's actually that exact 6-to-1 ratio. Okay, so we've got overcallers down here and undercallers up here. And this is true in every field of medicine. Okay, there's some doctors that are more aggressive, we're always going to do surgery. And there's some that are more conservative. Okay, we will always observe you. And this is what it looks like on a grid. Okay, some people have looked at these data and said, well, you've got the wrong 8 experts. It turned out that when we did the revised international classification of ROP system, so this has been revised 3 times since 1984. There were 30 experts. We did this experiment again. It was that exact 6-to-1 ratio. Okay, with the experts that came up with the international terminology. Okay, so this is a real thing. Overcallers, undercallers. The other thing is that if you go down each of these columns an image, right? You calculate an average score for that image. So give it 1 point for a normal diagnosis, 2 points for pre-plus, 3 points for plus, average it out and convert it to a color. That's what this row is here, the average. And down on this side, the images are very green on the right because everyone diagnosed them as as normal. Down the left, they're very red because everyone diagnosed them as plus. But in the middle here, there's every color shade in between. Okay, and the point that I'm trying to make with this is that the real world is a continuous spectrum of abnormality. And we hear about these terms like evidence-based medicine that make it sound like patients come in buckets, right? Normal, mild, moderate, severe. And people don't come in buckets, and we come on a spectrum. And the job of the doctor is to place people into buckets, for purposes of treatment and diagnosis, but we're not very good at that. Okay, some people draw the lines here, others draw it here, and this is a problem that we need to solve with AI. So I want to just say a word about classification versus comparisons. If you ask the question, plus, pre-plus, or normal, that's the reds, greens, and yellows. We're asking doctors to classify. We're not very good. Okay, this shows those 8 experts. Okay, these are weighted kappas, a measure of agreement, and darker is better. We're not very good at agreeing. But if you show doctors 2 images side by side, and if you ask them which one is more severe, number 1 or number 2, that's a comparison ranking, and we're really good at that. Okay, these same 8 experts agree very, very well on comparison rankings. And it's interesting, right, that ophthalmologists are good at, which is worse, number 1 or number 2. But in fact, if you what we can do is get 5 experts to sort 100 images from most mild to most severe. by doing these serial comparisons, 1 versus 2, 1 versus 3, 1 versus 4, 2 versus 3, 2, et cetera. If you do that thousands of times, you can rank order these images, through an ELO ranking, the same way that we rank, chess players. And these comparisons are really, really accurate. Adam Hanif, a resident in Oregon, wrote some really nice papers on this. And I want to come back to this later. But the point is that comparison rankings seem to be a lot more accurate than classification rankings. And when you're asking doctors to classify classify different things. Now, so at this point, I want to talk a little bit about what we'll call disagreement in process. Okay, and this takes us into the science and the art of medicine. Okay, I once was on a panel, and one of the experts on the panel at a conference, we were talking about plus disease in ROP, and the panelist said, "Well, plus disease, you can't really define it, but you know it when you see it because it just looks bad." Okay, and that was his sort of teaching about what he thinks about the nature of plus disease, and that comment really bothered me for months, because I thought, if we're trying to be scientific about things, how can we just be saying that they just look bad, just looks bad? But on the other hand, as I thought more, it's as a physician, sometimes things just look bad. As ophthalmologists, sometimes you'll look at a structure and say, "Oh, it just looks aggressive, it just looks angry or bad." And I've had intensive care unit doctors, tell me, "Well, that patient just looks sick." In a way that they can't really articulate why, but it's just that sense. And so I think that's a real thing, that clinical judgment of just looking bad. And so we got to thinking, well, could variability in the diagnostic process, in other words, if different experts have different concepts of what it means to just look bad, could that explain some of the variability that we're seeing in diagnosis? In other words, the reds, greens, and yellows on the previous slides. And so we thought, well, let's try to design a different type of experiment. We will capture and encode the detailed qualitative thoughts of 7 experts, okay, as they're diagnosing plus disease. And so what we did is we spent months choosing photographs, scripting questions, and asking experts. We videotaped them while they talked through their diagnosis and annotated, okay, what parts of the image make them worried or reassured. And then we had a cognitive psychologist go back and then analyze hours of videotape transcript to try to model the expert's thought process. And we tried to find the 7 most seasoned experts in the world, people who came up with the original definition of plus disease, that original classification scheme. And so here's what happened in the analysis. Okay, Nina Hewing, who was a visiting researcher from Germany, wrote up a really neat paper about this, where here's one image, and expert number 1 diagnosed it as plus, expert number 2 diagnosed it as pre-plus, expert number 3 diagnosed it as normal, and they're all looking at different parts of the retina. Okay, and so we went and looked in the literature. I think this is a real thing, that in every different part of ophthalmology and probably medicine, okay, there's a difference in diagnostic process as well as the overall diagnosis, and I think that's another thing to throw into the mix. Okay. So that really takes us into artificial intelligence for ophthalmology. I think there's been a ton of innovation in ophthalmology. In AI. And I captured this tweet from Eric Topol about 2 years ago. Of all the medical specialties, most people think radiology is leading the AI movement, but it's really ophthalmology so far. Okay, because we've got so many images coupled with clinical outcomes data. Okay, so for example, the first FDA-approved autonomous AI system in any field of medicine was for diabetic retinopathy. And that work was done by Michael Abramoff, who's a researcher at the University of Iowa. And the folks at Google did some beautiful work involving knowledge discovery regarding systemic health. Okay, 5 years ago, they published a paper showing that they could train a deep learning system to identify gender from retinal images. and with almost complete accuracy. And when people first read about that, people didn't believe it, because ophthalmologists cannot look at a retinal image and identify, is that from a male patient or a female patient? But presumably there's some data in the pixels that encodes sex, male versus female, and maybe we can take advantage of that at some point in the future. And in my little piece of the world, we developed systems to identify plus disease in ROP and received FDA breakthrough status, and trying to get that into the real world. Now, who did that work? James Brown, Pete Campbell, Jeshua Kalpathy-Kramer, Paul Chan, and others. Okay. And so there's a lot that we could talk about involving AI for ROP, but I just want to give one point here, that we are moving from qualitative to quantitative, and this is true in every field of medicine. In ophthalmology, we used to look at retinal images and use words and pictures, right, in the 1940s and 1950s up through the 80s with ROP, and now there's imaging that gives you data from this, and in ROP and for artificial intelligence, what we've been doing is translating this continuous spectrum of abnormality into a quantitative 1 to 9 scale. Okay, so the AI output, we get it, we convert it to a 1 to 9 scale, and why would we want to do that? Because from a clinical perspective, again, we're taking that continuous spectrum of abnormality and making it more granular. The 3-level scale that we use, plus, pre, plus, or normal, is just not enough granularity to make those determinations. Okay, is my patient better or worse? Week by week, as you examine these premature babies, the 1 to 9 scale gives you more granularity to make those distinctions. Now, from a practical perspective, I've given a lot of talks, and I often hear from ophthalmologists, well, I don't want a computer system to tell me plus or not, because won't it put me at medical legal liability if I don't treat a baby with plus disease? And I don't actually agree with that necessarily, but I've heard it so many times. And so the rationale here is that the AI is giving you a number from 1 to 9, and the clinician takes that number and then makes a management decision. So it's like blood pressure cuffs don't diagnose high blood pressure. Doctors diagnose high blood pressure based on data from blood pressure cuffs. And so it's the same analogy here. And plus, if you went from a 3 to a 6 in 1 week, that's different from going to a 5 to a 6 in 1 week. You may be more worried because of that slope. And so from experimental rationale, if doctors can't get plus, pre, plus, or normal correct, on a 3-level scale, there's no way we're going to get a 9-level scale accurate. But on the other hand, if we had standard images, okay, for 1 to 9, because we have good agreement from comparisons, in principle, the doctor could compare their image to each of these standard images. Where does it fit, and then make a really accurate determination of 1 to 9. Okay, so that's what we've been doing, and the point that I'm trying to make here is that we're going from qualitative to quantitative, and AI is a big part of that. Okay, Sang-Jin Kim, helped contribute, did a lot to contribute, in this type of work. Okay, qualitative to quantitative. Now, they've got that phrase, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And, what about image quality? Okay, what if you've got a bad image? Does it work? Does it not work for artificial intelligence? And, one of the things, we got interested in this. Aaron Coiner was a PhD student and now a faculty member in Oregon. And, he basically trained a deep learning system to identify image quality. Okay, so we had thousands of retinal images and had experts annotate them, acceptable for diagnosis, possibly acceptable, or not acceptable. And the deep learning system trained, how to categorize images that way. Okay, it turns out it can do that very accurately. And in fact, when we had the system rank order images from lowest quality to highest quality, and we compared that to the ranking of 6 different experts from lowest quality to highest quality using those ELO comparisons, it turns out that the system correlates, fairly well with expert ordering of these. And so what we're trying to do now is to incorporate this image quality metric into the operational AI system. So what have we learned from this about this particular disease, retinopathy of prematurity? I think these are general principles, that there's science, there's art, and there's technology. In the science for this disease, we've got the classification system, for example, that international classification system, and we've got clinical trials. Okay, those have revolutionized clinical care for this disease, but they're not perfect. Okay, for example, plus disease diagnosis, which is the core of the clinical trials, is subjective and qualitative. And that really takes us into the art, that these structured parameters, evidence-based medicine cannot capture all that qualitative nuance of disease. What does it mean to just look bad? And that takes us into technology, in this case, AI, going from qualitative to quantitative. And I just want to, argue in the spirit of AI for good, that, good clinical care is going to require all three. Okay, science, technology, and art. Okay, I would argue 2 out of the 3 is not good enough. Okay. So with that, I want to talk for the rest of the time about what we're doing at the National Eye Institute. Okay, so I started at the National Eye Institute in 2020, and one of the things that we've done is that we've created a strategic plan. And it happens that we've organized it around 7 cross-cutting areas of emphasis, and one of them is data science. And this is what I want to talk about, how that relates to artificial intelligence and some of the areas that I see as being priorities or opportunities for more work. So what's neat about vision and data science? 21st century science is characterized by what I'd call unprecedented access to large-scale data. And regardless of whether you're interested in biological systems, genomics, other omics data, genetics, imaging data, things like, we talked about a lot of that with ophthalmology, clinical data from electronic health records, or population-based data. There's a core set of data science methodologies here. And one thing that's neat about the vision field is that it's one of the areas where you've got really easy access to data along that whole spectrum of molecular and cellular processes all the way up to populations. Okay. So, if AI is so good, how come ophthalmologists are still in business? And, why hasn't it solved all of our problems? Well, I would argue there's a few, key unanswered research questions. And, obviously there's a lot, but I've tried to summarize a few of them on this slide. Okay, one of them is that AIs are really good for narrow tasks. Okay, is there plus disease in ROP in this baby? Does this patient have severe diabetic retinopathy? But the problem is that clinical diagnosis involves multiple parallel tasks. Okay, people have multiple diseases, multiple findings, and you've got to integrate image data together with clinical data, and we're not there in terms of what these systems can do. Number 2 is what I'd call generalizability and bias. Okay, and the real world is heterogeneous. There's different imaging devices, different races, different populations. And one thing that we've learned sometimes the hard way is that you cannot take findings in one race and generalize it to another. You can't take findings from one device that the system's been trained on and generalize it to another imaging device. And one study in the Korean radiology literature showed that only 6% of deep learning studies had any external validation. And lastly, I'd say that there's unclear ground truth. I think that we've sort of hammered that home in the plus disease example. Often there's diagnostic variability, and there are often unclear definitions or even processes of ascertaining, clinically significant endpoints. And I think this is a big problem in ophthalmology and medicine overall. Okay, getting ground truth. So what do we need? I would suggest that one thing we need is data sharing and data harmonization. Okay, so again, modern research relies on big data, regardless of what field you work in. And one of the paradigms that we often have is that there are often multiple small studies going on around the world that are essentially trying to answer the same question, but they are all individually underpowered to really be able to answer that question. Okay, and often these investigators are not incentivized to collaborate and share their data, and that's a big problem. But the other problem is that even if they were incentivized to share their data, they generally can't, because when those data were collected, using inconsistent representations or terminologies, you can't just combine those data sets. Okay, so there are a lot of opportunities that we're losing to advance the field because of these problems. So what do we do about it? At the National Eye Institute, we've got a data sharing policy that went into effect earlier this year, and the White House has additional guidance on data sharing. And those are what I would call sticks. Okay, for example, we won't fund your research at the NIH unless you come up with a data sharing plan. And I would argue that beyond that, we need carrots, incentives for data sharing to really be able to advance the field in this way. And one of the things that we've done in the vision field is that I meet with the editors-in-chief of the major vision journals a few times a year, and we tried to create a new publication type, a data set or software library. And so far, 2 out of those 7 journals have implemented that publication type, and trying to make it a thing within the vision community. So the idea is that you can publish your data set independent from a paper. Okay, people can cite it, people can find it using PubMed. And the hope here is that this can gradually shift that culture toward incentivizing data sharing and team science. And the first journal that did this was on TVST, and the editor was Marco Zarbin, and Pierce Keane from the UK and Aaron Lee are 2 of the associate editors, and wrote up an editorial about the rationale for this. Now, there's one other journal in Vision that's done this so far, Ophthalmology Science. The other thing we need is a common data model for ophthalmology. We don't have that. And at the NEI, we've been working with the American Academy of Ophthalmology to develop that common data model. And who's leading that? Sally Baxter in San Diego, Carrie Getz at the National Eye Institute, and Michelle Rybar, who's from Oregon, but doing a sabbatical at the NEI. Okay, so data sharing, data harmonization, really, really important. Okay, there's another thing that we need along those lines is ocular imaging standards. Okay, imaging is one of the bases for AI and data science in the vision field. And these data come from machines, right? They generate pictures and they generate numbers. And the problem is that we can't easily get data out of these machines because they're often locked in proprietary formats. Okay, this is a huge problem for clinical care and for research in vision science. And there have been, DICOM is the international standard that's used by radiological imaging devices. It's been used for decades. And almost all the common ocular imaging modalities have DICOM formats defined for them, but they are not implemented. And so this is a huge problem. I've personally been stymied by this for about 15 years in my career in various ways. And we need to solve this problem. And this is not just an ophthalmology problem. There's a lot of other imaging fields that have this issue. And last year, we got together to hold a imaging standards workshop. And who was participating? We did, the National Eye Institute, because and the point here is that we fund research. The US FDA, that group was led by Malvina Edelman at this workshop because they regulate medical devices. And the ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator for Healthcare Information Technology, and that group was led by Miki Tripathi because they regulate electronic data exchange in the US. And so what we try to do is, what levers can we create as 3 federal agencies working together to move the field forward toward interoperability, in this case in ocular imaging devices, but hopefully broader than that in the future. And so we spent 9 months planning this workshop, and there were hundreds of people who attended. And in follow-up to that, a few months later, the FDA recognized officially DICOM as the standard for ocular imaging devices, and stated that vendors can now declare conformance with DICOM in their labeling. And hopefully that's going to create a system of sticks and carrots. And a month later, the American Academy of Ophthalmology and ARVO, the leading research organization in vision science, issued a joint statement. They published it. The time is now for digital imaging standards implementation. And we'll have more information forthcoming about a follow-up statement from us about this. But this is a problem that we really need to solve, because it's going to advance clinical care and also research to have adoption of ocular imaging standards. Yeah, I think another thing that we're going to need is larger data sets that are AI ready and that allow us to address things like bias. Okay, I just want to make sure that you're aware of two examples of NIH-wide projects. One of them is called Bridge AI, and it's a common fund project in the NIH, meaning that it applies to any field of science or medicine. And the goal of this is to build large data sets from multiple sources. Okay, for example, imaging data, clinical data, omics data, wearables. And this is going to be $130 million over 4 years, basically to build data sets and to define standards and investigate ethical uses of develop ethics standards, okay, for data. And so this is a really different paradigm. We often talk about hypothesis driven research. Okay, this is $130 million for hypothesis generating data collection. And so actually, one of the things I'm particularly proud of is that one of those there were 4 data generation sites that were funded through this. And one of them was led by a team of ophthalmologists, Aaron Lee and Cecilia Lee at the University of Washington. And another project that I want to make you aware of is the AIM Ahead project. And that's coordinated by the Office of Data Science Strategy at the NIH, led by Susan Gregorek. And so again, this is a trans NIH project. And the premise of this is using AI to address challenges of health disparities in minority health. A huge problem in the US and worldwide. And how do we do that? Develop diverse data sets, train a diverse workforce, and develop AI approaches to detect bias. Okay, so up to $100 million to fund these coordinating and consortium centers. Okay, so larger data sets, AI ready to examine things like bias. Now, one of the other things that I think is going to be important is medical education in artificial intelligence and data science. If I were to ask the question, what is the one tool that's used by every single clinician and scientist in the US? Some people would say, well, maybe it's a stethoscope, maybe it's an ophthalmoscope, but I would argue that it's the computer. Okay, every single doctor that's the one tool that they use. But despite that, there is no systematic training or framework about how to use that technology. Okay, so compare that to how do you take a history, how do you do a physical exam, how do you listen to the heart using a stethoscope? Doctors and medical students will spend months to years of dedicated time to learn how to do those things. But for the one thing that every single doctor uses in their career, usually the amount of time is zero, okay, that people get that's dedicated to doing that. And I think people learn that by trial and error. And one of the other challenges is that in the US, usually the younger person learns through apprenticeship from the older person. Yet oftentimes when it comes to using computers, artificial intelligence, data science, it's the older person that's learning from the younger person. And so this is a problem. We've got to figure out ways to turn that paradigm upside down because if this is really changing the way, if this is going to be 21st century healthcare, there's a lot of challenges we're going to have to overcome. I think that we're going to need better mechanisms to improve delivery and access to care. One of the things that this pandemic really exposed is, to state the obvious, major disparities in healthcare. In the U.S., around the world, we saw this in every country. And maybe telehealth and artificial intelligence are going to be one of the ways that we address these disparities and improve access to care. And if that's the case, we're going to have to do a lot of evaluation studies involving implementation, efficacy, and cost effectiveness. And we're going to have to develop new models for remote care that are based on completely different paradigms. And I think that we're really going to have to understand, what are the social determinants that are relevant in this case to vision care, but healthcare more broadly. How can we integrate those factors, for example, into electronic systems, and put them together with everything else that contributes to somebody's health. Okay, so a lot of challenges here involving delivery and access to care. And lastly, I think we're going to need better electronic health record documentation practices. Okay, one of the challenges in electronic health records is that these notes are often very long and cumbersome. One of our residents, Brad Henriksen, just took a photograph of a note in the office. This was an eye exam note from a follow-up exam. It was 8 pages. And it's very common. Every physician has seen this. And, how come they're 8 pages? Doctors are copy pasting text from one note to the next. They're taking standardized macros with text and just copying them in. So we're often getting very long blurbs of standardized text put into these notes. It becomes tough to separate the signal from the noise in reading these notes. And so a few years ago, when I was working in Oregon, Adam Rule and Michelle Rybar, led a set of projects involving, we looked at EHR documentation practices. So this was 2.8 million electronic health record notes from over 40 medical specialties over a 10-year period. And we basically looked at things like found that notes are long. Okay, on the average, for ophthalmology, they were 6 pages, on the average. The content is heavily redundant. 45 to 75% word for word, from one note to the next when it's the same doctor and the same patient. And again, how come they're so long? Because they were copy pasted or put in from some sort of template. Only a small percentage of the content of these notes was actually typed in, from somebody as quote new content. And it's getting worse over a 10-year period. Okay, so that raises the questions really. Okay, are we documenting for clinical care, or are we documenting for billing and compliance? And if data are really the new oil, what is the research value of notes that are largely copy pasted and templated, where doctors themselves can't identify, the signal from the noise? Okay, so I think we're going to have a lot of challenges in terms of documentation practices in electronic health records. So this is my final slide. I've really tried to argue that science and computing are having a transformative impact on clinical practice. We made the point that we're moving from qualitative to quantitative, and examples of that: artificial intelligence, imaging, evidence-based practice. And I've been thinking more and more in terms of this concept. What is your added value as a clinician? Okay, back when I trained to become an ophthalmologist in the 2000 was when I finished up. I had to learn to use this device. It's a contact lens. Okay, it goes onto the eye and it lets you examine the nuance of the retina, okay, very, very carefully. And after doing this in hundreds or thousands of patients, I became really good at detecting that nuance of structural change. Okay, with my own eyes, I could recognize that. And I always thought that was my added value, right? I could do that, and other people couldn't see that data that I was getting out of it. The problem is that nobody does that anymore. Okay, now today's trainees don't even know how to use this device. Instead, we get images. And these images can give you quantitative data that just wasn't available, back in 2000. And so one of the things that I've been wondering is that if everybody sees the same images, and if everybody sees the exact same numbers that are generated from those same images, okay, what is your added value as a clinician? You've got the ultra subspecialized retinal specialist, you've got the general ophthalmologist, the optometrist, or the patient, using Google search, looking up, what those numbers mean. So what is our added value as clinicians and subspecialists going to be? And I think that there's a lot of work that the community is going to have to do in figuring that out. I would argue that clinicians, this is going to require a collaborative approach. Okay, clinicians are going to need to identify clinically relevant questions, build large data sets, build diverse data sets, understand what those technologies can do and how they can take advantage of those technologies, but just as importantly, understand what those technologies cannot do and cultivate those skills. And wouldn't it be ironic if one of those things that the technologies cannot do is talk to patients? And if we're losing those uniquely human skills because all we're doing is copy pasting, old notes, so that I think is going to be really, really important. And I think engineers are going to need to develop those methodological advancements to identify solutions that generalize across fields and ensure the use of these imaging standards and data representation standards. And ultimately, it's going to require a collaborative approach. So I'm really excited by this, but I think it's going to take a lot of work, and I think it's going to take ideas from communities like this. And so really excited to be here. And I just want to thank you, for the privilege of letting me speak here today.
Wow. So thank you, Mike, for a really, really invigorating and engaging talk. I really appreciate how you kind of integrated your own work, talking about the moving from qualitative to quantitative and giving examples of that into some more, really, really high level, agency level, big ideas. So the micro, the macro interplay was very interesting for me. So with that, we're going to start our Q&A part of this session, and we'll probably go up until 10-ish. And while people are adding their questions to the chat on the neural network, I'm actually going to be a bit selfish and start with my own questions. So for those of us who do not really know what breakthrough status from the FDA means, and that most definitely includes myself, could you kind of give a high-level overview of what that means, and kind of also give a little bit of insight into how you're able to navigate that process when your team achieved the breakthrough status from the FDA, especially with regards to how you're able to talk to the audience who may not be so familiar with, an assisted artificial intelligence system, and how you could help them appreciate and see the value of that.
Yeah, Harrison, thanks for asking about all those. A couple things I would say to answer that. One of them is that breakthrough status is not FDA approval. It basically means that you have a fast track to approval. And the one thing that I took away from, I ended up getting to know the FDA pretty well, through this process. And, the one thing that I took away from that is, these are opinions, not facts that I'm about to share. But with that disclaimer, I think that groups like the FDA, I think, are there to help people. In other words, one of the purposes is to protect, the American public, by making sure that devices are, safe. But I think that for people who are interested in building devices, engage them early, because they can give you some guidance about what it takes to get something approved. Because I think very often what I'm seeing and what I saw in my own work is that when you do these things in isolation, and if you go down one track, and if you could have talked to them earlier, they could have given you advice to provide the data that they need, for approval. So that is one of the things I think. Another thing that I learned is that having a neat technology that produces good paper is not enough to make a product that's useful for people. And I think one thing that I learned to think a lot of is, in their parlance, what is the indication for use? Who's going to be using it and in what setting, and what's the outcome going to be when this product gives you the answer that you're going to get. So that's so those are some of the things that I took away from working with them.
Wow, that's really, really good advice, and really interesting to hear. Kind of along the lines of that, I know you talked a lot about team science, and the field that we work in is inherently extremely interdisciplinary. So as someone who has both led research teams and is now at the helm of an agency, do you see that there are ways to kind of lower barriers for two worlds to kind of bridge together, and for people coming from different professional backgrounds to kind of work together and see each other's perspectives? And how have you kind of tried to cultivate that type of atmosphere of team science in your work?
Harrison, I think that there are a lot of different aspects of team science, but let me get at one of them, and we can talk about several of them, but let me talk about one of them, this whole interdisciplinary aspect. I see a lot of grants and ideas, and there are a lot of, universities have people from different fields. And I think one of the things that disappoints me sometimes is when I see projects where I suspect that the doctor and the scientist collaborated when they wrote the grant, and they got back together when they wrote the paper, but they didn't do a ton in between. Okay, and I think that I hate to say that, but I think that happens a lot more than it should. And I think that one of the things that I learned, actually from Michael Abramoff, who was at the University of Iowa, who had a amazing team of people. From watching him early in my career, that's how I learned to build my team. And we had a group of, in my case, ophthalmologists and medical informatics people. So we had our own, doctors, clinical trainees, informatics PhD students, informatics fellows, and then we had a group of computer scientists. It happened those computer scientists were in Boston. One of them was Jayshree Kapather-Kramer, one of them was Dennis Ardogmas, and they had their team of people, their grad students, their fellows, and we met every single week for 10 years. Actually, continue to meet now for 2 hours, and these were, this was, so I've tried every single video conferencing platform before, before the pandemic, and it was awesome. And those few times a year that we got together in person for a few days and just brainstorm ideas and just go in your war room, and that I thought was amazing. And to me, that's sort of my mental model of doing interdisciplinary science, really getting people to, getting the doctors to understand the technical aspects and the engineers to understand the clinical aspects. And so it's my hope that, of course, we're going to try to stimulate people really getting together, to do that. And I think one of the challenges in the AI, in the spirit of AI for good, is that, there are a lot of smart engineers in the world who want to solve problems. And, I hope that we can attract them to the healthcare and medical research sector by providing data and providing problems that are important to solve. Because, for people who want to, for people who have technical skills and who want to solve problems that make a difference and make the world a better place, I think there's a lot of work that's going to need to be done in, for all the things that we've talked about here, plus more.
Yeah, I think that's really, really good advice. And it sounds like persistence and a lot of cohesiveness and hand-in-hand work is what should really make the wheel turn. We have a few questions from Zahid, but I'm going to summarize into one, so it's more easy to answer. So Zahid is kind of asking about, so you talked a little bit about data harmonization and trying to kind of leverage multiple data sources instead of just using, silo, narrow data sources when people are thinking about data science in medicine at large. So Zahid is asking more about how you see the interplay of the patient data privacy and patient data safety and that data sharing happen, and how are you going to incentivize data sharing while also guaranteeing that level of, patient privacy and respecting that?
Yeah, Zahid, I think that's an extremely important question. I don't know that there's a good answer, but let me try to restate what I think the issues are, and just how I'm thinking about it and how we're thinking about it. On the one hand, researchers want, the whole premise of big data is that we've got large data sets. And researchers are going to want to have access to more and more data. And researchers are data hungry, basically, and in many cases can do amazing things with those data that can potentially benefit large populations. And so that's the plus. The minus is that the more data. The minus is that the more data are available, the higher the risk is that people can be identified, from the data that are out there. And furthermore, I think that risk is getting worse to data privacy, because as technologies and computing power gets better, okay, what might have been considered de-identified 20 years ago or even 5 years ago may have potential to be reverse engineered, and people can be identified potentially from things where we would have thought, oh, there's no way that you could figure out a generation. And there's been many examples of people being able to reverse engineer and figure out who this person actually was. And I think that's the fundamental tension, that as technologies improve, we can do more amazing things with the data, but we can also figure out more, like who, what patient those actually belonged to. And I also, in this country, and I assume almost every country in the world, there are some people who have opinions that are in different areas on that spectrum. Some advocates for patient privacy, some advocates for big data. And meanwhile, we've also got a culture around the world where, I think in my opinion, the standards for privacy may be shifting. My kids and my kids' friends are posting things about themselves on social media, often, involving things like protected health information that I wouldn't have considered making public, a generation ago. And and the last thing I'll say with that is that there are many companies out there, drugstores, online, marketplaces, social networking sites that are taking data and in some cases using it for analytics. And in some cases, we've all had situations where, our private information has ended up somewhere where we didn't expect it to be, because it presumably got sold, somewhere. And so I think that there are groups that are more aggressive about pushing the boundaries, and there are groups that are more conservative about the boundaries. And Zahid, that's what I see as the challenge. I don't feel like we have that sweet spot of where we are. And one of the other problems is that I think that there are a lot of people, a lot of groups that are defining, by putting them out into practice. There's data that are being used right now on different parts of that spectrum of privacy to data sharing. And I think that we're going to need to have some consensus in our society about what is appropriate. Where's that appropriate set point of where we are? One possibility is that every patient consents for their use of data, either through an opt-in or opt-out mechanism. But we're going to need to have a multidisciplinary group that develops standards for this. As you can imagine, this is one thing that we're interested in at the National Institutes of Health overall, but it is a very complicated issue.
Great. Thanks, Mike, for the really, really comprehensive and nuanced perspective on the issue. So I think, Mike, I want to be really respectful of your time. Would you have time for like 2 more questions to go until 10:05? Or
I would be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you so much. So the last question, I'll do one more question from the audience, and I'll conclude with one of my own questions for you. But the last question from the audience is, can you talk a bit about the adoption of these AI models by the healthcare sector? And I'll kind of add in, how do you see the physician AI or physician informatics dynamic to look like going forward, perhaps 50 or 80 years from now in the clinic when you're actually dealing with patients?
Harrison, I think that's a good and also very nuanced question. I think that in terms of adoption, it's confusing right now. I think the number of papers being published about AI is far greater, than the amount of AI that's being adopted in the real world. In fact, you could argue that the amount of AI that's being adopted in the real world, for most fields of medicine is often zero. But I'm talking real world clinical care. I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the potential reasons is that there's a lot of reasons. Workflow, validation. Are these really answering clinically relevant questions? Are they answering questions enough? It gets back to that issue of when a doctor looks at a patient, it's very broad, what they're evaluating, and what AI systems look at is often very narrow, identifying very specific questions. We don't have a good way to chain, all these different AIs together to come up with a holistic assessment of
Right.
what's going on. And, I think ultimately, one of the things that I hope is that AI is something that right now, I think it's still within the domain of what the nerds do. And it's going to have to move into the mainstream. And I think that there's a lot of issues with this. One of them is that, on the average, a lot of people who build these systems may not even be physicians themselves. Sometimes the people who build these systems who are physicians or who are the key clinical collaborators, maybe people who tend to be more junior. And oftentimes the decision makers in medical systems are people who are more senior. And I think that for technology more broadly, there's going to have to be a way to bridge the decision makers with the people who are actually doing the work. And I think that I've been hearing a lot of, so I think that's one set of issues. I've been hearing a lot of issues involving explainability of AI findings. That deep learning systems are so-called black boxes, and I don't. A few years ago, we all heard that a lot, and in fact, one of my last grants before I took this position at the NEI, one of the specific aims involved explainability for ROP AI systems. And I as I've thought more and more, I'm not, my opinion is that I'm not so sure how important that's going to be. I think that people are asking about it because, it's a new technology that
Right.
none of us really understand. And, I'm not sure, how many doctors really understand how the explainability of an MRI scanner, or most people drive a car. Like, how many people really understand how a car works? And at some level, you pass a threshold where people trust those technologies because they've been validated and they are. But I think the deeper question is to get to the last part, Harrison, of what you asked, is that I think there's a lot in terms of how doctors use these technologies that we're going to have to figure out. I have a lot of concerns that in using these technologies, doctors may not pay as much attention to the nuance of clinical care, or the nuance of talking to patients, or in some of our data, I believe I've seen evidence, of that. And I think there's going to have to be a careful thought of, how can doctors, again, understand these technologies and what they do and how they can use them to really help them take better care of patients. And also understanding what the technologies don't do and making sure that those are the skills that they cultivate in themselves and also in the people that they teach to become future doctors. Because I see that as being a lot of the future of of healthcare and how it integrates in your scenario of 50 years in the future. Because I think those are the things that we're going to have to pay attention to. I guess the last thing that I'll say, I'm sorry to be so long-winded, is that if I had to honestly introspect in terms of looking at the medical education system now versus 25 years ago when I was going through the medical education system, I don't think the education system has changed nearly as much as the field has changed. And I think that's a big problem, actually.
Wow, fascinating thoughts. I do want to be respectful of your time, so I'm going to go to the final question, and it's, I promise, much less nuanced. It's more big picture. And I kind of wanted to ask about, your training and your current role. So you, like, as director of the NEI now, you have a lot of tools at your hands to really shape and influence scientific and health policy in the country. And what the objectives are for, what researchers work on and what things want to be funded. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of perspective on how your clinical and research training background has enhanced your ability to kind of, target problems and identify problems and produce innovative policy to start to address them, and also vice versa, how, being in your new role has shaped or changed the way you think as a doctor or a researcher.
Harrison, it's a good question. I think I only know my perspective on the world. So it's so when I answer and say things like, this was good for me, and I don't know what it'd be like to have anybody else's background, but I feel like as somebody who, we did our mission statement when I started, to eliminate vision loss and improve quality of life through vision research. And I feel like as a physician, you can see firsthand, okay, what the impact of, disease and healthcare is on people's lives. Okay, and that gets in this concept of quality of life. And as a researcher, you not only understand, how to design and, finish projects, but also sort of you understand that feedback cycle, right, of how gaps in care inspire research projects and how research projects can, hopefully result in better care, and that it's a continuous cycle that way. And as a interdisciplinary researcher, me understands how sometimes getting people from different backgrounds into the same room and looking at the same question. There's a lot of smart people in the world from different, from different
Exactly.
parts and histories. And sometimes when you get those different perspectives, that's when you really make those advances. And one of the things that I've also learned sometimes the hard way is the importance of humility. That you have to know when you don't know something, and that you have to know when to ask somebody else, and that being comfortable with not knowing answers is sometimes the heart of being a good researcher. And so I think those are the things that I've taken away from this, and those have really been some of the things that I think are continuing to help me do my current job.
Awesome. Really inspiring to hear and really exciting to hear as well. So with that, I'd just like to thank you again, Mike, for giving us your time and sharing all of your wealth of experiences, perspectives, and advice. And we're really, really excited that you could join us. And I also like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today, and we hope that we will see you again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Harrison.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
AI is a powerful tool.
This summit can help ensure that artificial intelligence charts a course that benefits humanity and bolsters our shared values.